Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a special edition of Inside the Birds Analytics Edition. And of course, that means we bring back our analytics expert, Sam Finkel. Sam, what's going on? Glad to have you. And I know this is an exciting time of the year for you, as you have always done for the last few years on InsideTheBirds.com, some analytics projects related to our draft prospects. But now we're putting it in podcast form. And honestly, it comes at a great time because we've just started our series with Greg Cosell, the Intel with Greg Cosell, where we're breaking down many of the top prospects at each position by position, in a podcast series. So we're going to literally follow that same style, whereas we started off with Greg on edges and then interior defensive linemen. We're going to follow that same course with you, and we're going to have an analytics discussion about a lot of these college prospects that I know people are excited to hear about. And I'm going to let you get into it about the type of project that you put together. But I want to introduce the concept here that we know NFL teams constantly battle with when they're doing scouting. They watch tape, they see players, but then the reason why we have combines and pro days and athletic testing is because teams are obsessed with athletic testing and whether that measures the tape. And to add to that, Sam, there's a lot of players in colleges from smaller programs, mid-level programs where they're not necessarily surrounded by great talent, but they're great athletes, and they wind up producing better at the NFL level than at the pro level because they're not surrounded. You know, especially defensive line, that's an area where your environment means as much as just yourself as an individual player. You can get 1,000 pressures, but never be able to get a sack because nobody finishes it off, for example. And so on the stat sheet, it doesn't look like you were very productive, even though you were. So I know in this discussion we're going to have is about athleticism versus production and who really, fits that bill and who maybe fills one of those two criteria and what that means for their NFL future.
Absolutely. This was a fun project too. It's a really cool tool that I think everyone will enjoy.
Yeah. And I know you're going to say this, but I'll repeat it too. The thing with analytics that we always say is that we use it as a tool. It is not the be all to end all. I'll give an example when we talk about athleticism versus production, right? In the 2014 draft, this really always jumps to mind for me. There were two kind of preeminent pass rushers coming out. One was an athletic freak named Charles Harris from Missouri, right? Body beautiful, testing beautiful, ran the 40 fast, high jump, vertical, all that. Great. The other was Derek Barnett, who was not like an athletic freak of nature, but he had the production. He broke Reggie White's career sack total at the University of Tennessee. Both went in the first round. Obviously, Eagles know about Derek Barnett. And both of them just had careers so far. And I don't think that they're getting any better. Like Barnett's had some glimpses, some spurts. Certainly as a rookie, he was big on the 2017 Super Bowl champion Eagles. And I think Harris had like one or two good years, either in Miami or Detroit, but it's generally not been a first rounder. So that just goes to show you could be highly productive, you could be highly athletic, and neither could be in your favor. But it's not a be all to end all, but it's fun because we know the NFL uses these tools.
Yeah, trust me. And if there was an algorithm or, a statistical analysis that could be created that would be predictive, it'd be like $1 billion idea. So to be honest with you, it's just part of the process, right? It helps, complement the eye test. Right. So, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Right. So what you've done is created a bunch of charts based on athletic testing and production that I'm going to share the screen so that our YouTube viewers can be able to see it. Hopefully they'll be able to see it well, but we'll explain it too. The charts represent different things. They're comparison charts as well. You use several of the top edge rushing pass prospects in this draft. I don't think you did all of them because that would take like a million years, but a lot of the big names, right?
So I did every single one that NFL had the combine data or pro day data on.
Okay.
So the way we actually use the data is, so NFL produces with next gen stats. They take every pro day and combine performance and rate that on a scale for athleticism, and then they look at college production and they have an algorithm that projects, what is that production value. So what I did was I used that NFL next gen stats to create these charts, and that's where it's sourced from. and it is an algorithm using NFL Next Gen Stats.
So the charts we're about to show are the edge prospects in comparison. First, their athletic testing versus their college production, how that compares against each other. We're going to compare that against past first round picks over the last 4 years. We're going to compare this year's group to the last, top 100 picks also?
Yep, over the last 4 years.
Right. And then what else? There's
And
one more.
average drafted in the last 4 years.
Correct. And then you're also created some charts, which I think are really useful, about what Eagles edge rushers in the past a couple of years, where they would fall in that as well. We're talking about the Jalix Hunts and Nolan Smiths of the world, edge rushers the Eagles have drafted, and look at a comparison of this year's class as well. And then at the end, you just have some other, underlying data and metrics that are really interesting that we'll get into.
Absolutely.
All right, so let me first see if the good old screen share is going to cooperate. I believe it will. And we will take our first look here at the edge projection chart, the first one that you put together. Do you see this?
Yeah, I see it.
You created it, so I imagine you don't really need to see it, but I just wanted to make sure.
For sure, but it does help, for sure.
All right.
I would love to just take a quick minute just to describe how the chart works.
You have the floor.
So it's a scatter plot, like I said, that represents on the y-axis the athleticism and on the x-axis production. And so what that means is if you look to the left side of the chart, you can see athleticism ceiling, and on the bottom you can see production, which is the floor. And the reason why we're saying floor and ceiling is because even though it's not a one-to-one in terms of production in college, if an athlete that produces in college, is likely to produce in the NFL. And there's a lot of variables there, strength of competition. There's a lot of things that go into that. But it provides a nice baseline for floor. While athleticism, if you're very athletic, you have higher upside versus less athletic is a little bit less. So that's why ceiling is a good way to measure it. Right. So that being said, these red lines on there represent the average drafted player in the average drafted edge, in the last 4 years. So if you look at that, each line intersects, you can see it creates 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. If you look at the top right quadrant, that represents a player that is extremely athletic and a high producer, or someone that has a high ceiling and a high floor. Those are your blue chip, proverbial blue chip players. Those are the guys you really want to go after, mm-hmm. And are usually higher sought after. If you look at the bottom right of the chart, that is your players that produced very well in college, but didn't necessarily score well on the athleticism side. Mm-hmm. Those are generally safe players because they have a high floor, but a lower ceiling. Right. If you look at the top left of the chart, those are the players that scored very, very well in athleticism, but did not produce very well in college. Those are your hidden gems. There's someone with very high ceilings, but you really don't know the floor. Mm-hmm. And then the bottom left are typically players you'd like to avoid because they didn't produce well in college and they didn't test very well in athleticism.
Got it. All right. So obviously, your first rounders are going to come from the upper right quadrant, as you mentioned. That's high production and high athleticism. You'll find some guys probably bottom of the first who are in that safe territory because they produced. College NFL teams are big on production. They are big on athletic testing, but I would say secondarily to that, the ones I speak to constantly talk about, did you produce in college? Even if you weren't the greatest athlete. So someone, for example, like we mentioned Derek Barnett, who was not a great athletic tester, but still broke a sack record, he'd probably fall in that bottom right quadrant that we were talking about.
And there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of value in that bottom right quadrant. Sure. And as you can see, if we can move down to the green chart really quick, because I think that's a good place to kind of start with this discussion. Mm-hmm. And this green line represents first round average.
Okay.
So this will be your first round guys in athleticism and in production.
So, and that's over the last how many years again?
Last 4 years.
So over the last 4 years, so our listeners who don't see the chart know, our last 4 years, an average first round edge was about grade 77, 78 in production and about 79 in athleticism. And this is on a 0 to 100. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. So that's where the green intersecting lines for the last 4 years of first rounders, it's right around, what did I say, 78 in production, 79 in athleticism. And when you look at this year's class of edge rushers, Sam, there's only 3 guys that actually test it better in that upper right quadrant of they beat the average, right?
Right. And
Those guys are
so the obvious one is Abdul Carter. And, there's a very low chance that the Eagles would even have the opportunity to draft him, despite, especially you and I, our dream of that.
yes.
And I will say one of the other names on there is one that lives in Penn State fans' nightmares. That is JTT out of Ohio State.
Yep.
If you look at his highlight reel, I think like the first 15 plays are against Penn State or so. So
yeah.
But very, very athletic and produced very well in college. But there's one name on there that really is striking to me, and that's Donovan Ezaraku out of Boston College.
Mm-hmm.
He is probably one of my favorite prospects in this draft. The Eagles just had their top 30 visit with him. Local New Jersey kid. I'm sure you probably want to speak more on that part of it.
Well, it wasn't until you mentioned. Well, first of all, he was already on our radar because Adam mocked him to the Eagles in his 1.0 mock draft. He may have done also 2.0. I haven't caught up yet, but I knew you told me he was a Jersey kid, and then I did research on him. And I said, "Holy cow, he's Williamstown," which is like my neck of the woods. So I was surprised that I didn't remember that.
Yeah, he's very special. He doesn't necessarily have the size, and I believe his bench wasn't particularly great. But he, as far as athletic testing goes, he really is above average, and he was an above average producer. And I think he could realistically be within range of the Eagles drafting at 32, or maybe they'll have to move up a little bit, but he should be right around that area and would be a pretty good fit.
So he's a really explosive kid. Greg Cosell liked him a lot. Talked about him on the Intel with Greg Cosell for people who haven't checked that out. Greg couldn't come up with very many negatives to his game, but I guess the reason, Sam, that he is not maybe discussed in the same breath as an Abdul Carter, or I'm not even sure what the range is for JTT, but for Donovan, I know that his size, he's a little on the light side at, I believe, around 254, which is not, I mean, you can certainly play edge in the NFL at 254, but I also think his arm length is a little shorter than desired. But that was all Greg could say.
Yeah. And I think that's what the tape says. It's obviously what the statistics are saying. Mm-hmm. So if there is an opportunity to draft him, it kind of seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah. Let's go back. I'm going to go back to the original red line, because now this red line represents all of this year's edges, correct? And how if you combine
all of this year's edges that have the data. So there were a couple that did not have NFL Next Gen stats on, so they were removed, but they were more of like the lower end guys anyway. So
right. So if you look at that, the average edge that you have data on coming out for this, eligible for this draft, is tests around a little under 70 in production and a little under, between 70 and 75 in athleticism. It seems to speak to this edge class in general not being as strong as some of the last 3 years, only because the green line that represented the last 4 years, the numbers were closer to 80, correct?
Yeah, that's just the first round talent on average, and
right.
So I definitely could see you saying that. But I think that there's a lot more that goes into it too. Like for instance, a lot of guys that may be picked could be, like the Shamar Stewart type guys, which probably would fall more in like the second round. But they're higher upside guys that they can kind of project. What I thought was interesting is some of the other guys that you hear when you talk about edges, like Mike Green and James Pierce, tend to fall under that athleticism line, but have a really good and solid production in the college level.
Right. And if you notice, again, Carter and Ezaraku for this year's class test way higher than the average in terms of athleticism and production. Shamar Stewart, interesting name out of A&M because this guy. Now, I guess here his athleticism testing, he is probably third best or fourth best here. I'm trying to right up there. Go ahead.
Definitely up there for sure. That's
yeah, he's definitely up. The only one higher, it appears, would be the only higher Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, Jared Ivey, and Landon Jackson.
Yeah.
So that would put him right up
JTT there. Might be a little bit higher too.
Okay, it looked like they're on the same, but maybe a little bit. Only 3 unquestionably higher, but he is almost, as your chart shows here, he is athletic through the roof. Production not there, below averages compared to the other first rounders, right? Because as Greg Cosell pointed out, he's seemingly a guy who has an amazing amount of athleticism, but sort of is just learning how to really rush the pass, like to have a plan, to understand how to finish, with use your hands and finish off moves. But someone is probably from the athletic testing itself might take a chance on him pretty early.
Yeah, I think there is validity to that too. I mean, just because you're a raw prospect, everyone thinks they have the best coaching staff in the world, and they can transform guys, even raw guys. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But the numbers suggest that it could. And so some teams will think that's worth it.
Got it. What other names here? I see Jack Sawyer is a little bit better than average. Cosell had some questions on his viability as a true pass rusher in the league. He did like Braden Swinson from LSU.
Yeah. So Braden Swinson, to me, especially from like an analytics perspective, is a really solid guy. He'll be a prospect that will, get the job done. But he's not going to win a lot of battles just on pure athleticism. He's a very technically sound, fundamental pass rusher, and there's value in that. But he's not one of the best athletes.
Totally, absolutely get that. But it's still and still a little higher than average, though. A little higher than average on what that would be athleticism, a little below average on production, or do I have that backwards?
Backwards. So he is an above average producer, a slightly below average athlete.
Right. Anything? What jumps out from that's a danger sign? I guess someone like Quindarius Robinson and Ja Joyner. Is Ja Joyner the Minnesota kid?
So Ja Joyner is the one Minnesota kid, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to be in this box where he and Quindarius Robinson are in.
For sure. Those are the two that I would certainly say that should be avoided at all costs, unless maybe you can get them very, very late and you see something, on film, or there's some other reason to take them. But from an analytics perspective, with this tool in particular, it would say avoid.
All right. Let's get to that other chart that you had here. And this is with the Eagles of the past draft picks thrown in there. So this is an idea of just how ridiculous. No, and remember when Nolan Smith came out, he was so athletic, but there was questions about whether he'd be an inside linebacker. Is he a run and chase guy who should be an off the ball linebacker? Can he be an edge rusher? Is he strong? Is he powerful enough? Because as this chart showed, his production as an edge was not there compared to his athleticism was.
Right. And so that if you look, all 3 of the Eagles rotational players right now are in that top left corner, which is your hidden gems. And if you look at the selections, right? So Smith was the first round pick, 30th overall. Hunt was last year's draft 3rd round, 94th overall. And Ajomo was a 7th round pick, 249. Probably should have been higher selected, but injury, limited his selection. So you look, the Eagles have a lot of history, at least in the past couple years, in this top left corner. And an interesting name that is in this top left corner as well is someone else they had a top 30 visit with, that being Elijah Roberts. So basically, that's another thing to look out for.
Elijah Roberts. Where did he go? I forget all of a sudden.
So Elijah Roberts went to SMU.
Right, SMU. Okay. I'm looking for his name here. Why am I?
So he is right by the middle, basically right by the middle. Yeah,
Okay,
right
so
there.
Aaron. Oh, yeah. Here we go. Elijah Robert. Right, he falls in the middle there. What jumps out is Ajomo actually falls in the gems box because honestly, he's a tackle, not an end, right? So the fact that he can test above average here athletically, right, and his production. I mean, for a tackle, he has
For a
somewhat edge like projection, so that's pretty good.
Yeah, it was weird. He was on the edge list on, and I was trying to keep it, as clear as possible. There's a couple guys actually through the past couple years that were on both the edge and the tackle, and
Uh-huh.
I just had to go with whatever was listed
Yeah,
on
that's fine. He probably moved around a lot of Texas, and I'm sure he probably played some big end in an odd front, That's not surprising.
for sure. But it is interesting that he still fits into this.
Yeah.
He's still a better athlete than most edge players, which just goes to show you
Mhm.
his potential.
Yep. So it also shows the Eagles are not afraid. I wouldn't say you put him in a box, but especially in the second, after the first round. In first round, we know that they value production at a really high level. I don't think they would take a kid anymore. They used to do this in the past in the first 50, I don't think Jalex Hunt to them could have been a top 50 guy because he didn't play at a really high level in college, right? They like production, they like athleticism, but once you get to round 3, 4, 5, whatever, they're not afraid, right? To take a guy like Hunt, they're not afraid if they see a guy fall like Ajomo who tests really well to really value what that athletic testing means.
For sure.
All right. Next chart that's the green one that we looked at already, which is the versus the first round draft selections of the last 4 years. Man, Abdul Carter, he's about as can't miss as it gets, doesn't he? Isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, it feels good to be able to say that, but yes, that is the verdict.
Crazy thing for those who don't know is that Abdul Carter didn't even play edge rusher until this past year at Penn State. He was an off the ball linebacker because amazingly, Penn State 2 years ago had two NFL defensive ends. They had Chop Robinson, who was a first round pick of the Dolphins. And they had Isaac, who he did get drafted, or he was in a camp with somebody.
He did get drafted, yeah.
Yeah, he got drafted. I can't remember what team, but so they felt like, hey, we have this great athlete in Abdul Carter. Let's at least get him on the field, and we'll put him at stack linebacker. And you could tell Greg Cosell even said you can watch the tape. He was their best player overall on defense, and then they move him to edge this past year, and he just really explodes.
Yeah, and a local kid and somebody that would love to play for the Eagles too, which is I wish it
maybe in
worked
4 or 5 years when he flames out with the Giants. No, I'm just kidding.
We can dream. Okay, we can dream about that.
So now you added the Eagles draft picks over the last few years to what the first round picks of over the last 4 years averaged, just to show. And Nolan Smith, again, his athletic testing through the roof.
Yeah, it's really impressive, and you can see why the Eagles felt a first rounder was justified there. And that's why I feel like you can't always just look in this top right quadrant. You have to look in the top left and the bottom right quadrant as well, even in the first round, which is why you're going to see guys like James Pierce and Mike Green, who are in that bottom right, still be selected in the first round.
Yeah. And honestly, if you look at Pierce, it's not too far away. It's not, and honestly, Green too. Green a little bit more than Pierce. It's not like they're that far away from being right at where the average for the first round. They're probably 75, 76, right? And 79 is the number I'm thinking here.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah. So these guys probably are, I would say, they're definitely probably top 50, but you could see them going in the bottom of the first round.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The Ezuraku, he continues to be in this upper right quadrant, and he really continues to interest me. I believe he had 16 sacks his last year, Sam, with Boston College.
Yeah, it was something crazy like that. I have his total sack count here, which was 24 for the 3 seasons. So I mean, he really exploded onto the scene for sure.
Yeah. All right, our next chart here with the purple lines. This is now this year's crop of edge rushers against the top 100 selections over the last 4 years, correct?
That is correct.
Not surprising. You get the same three guys, Abdul Carter, Donovan Ezraku, and JTT from Ohio State, all in that dominating upper right-hand quadrant area.
But two new names are kind of interesting here. Actually, I got to say three. So Antoine Powell-Ryland is a very interesting from Virginia Tech, is also in that top right in the top, 100 picks, which means that he could be a day 2 guy, and maybe he's not even projected day 2. I'm not really sure where consensus has him, but I mean, he's definitely justified based on this tool, at least, taking a shot on him a little bit later.
Right.
The other interesting names are Jack Sawyer, who falls right smack dab in the middle of the averages.
Yep.
But the name I really wanted to also focus on is Colin Oliver. So he has a little bit of an interesting. He's the Oklahoma State, sorry. But he didn't play much this season, like this most recent season. But I believe if you looked at his stats from 2 years ago, they were pretty good and probably would have pushed him to be a better prospect in this year had the seasons been switched.
Right.
Right. But that's a name I also.
What school is he from again?
Oklahoma State.
Oklahoma State, right.
Yeah. And so that's a guy that I also think is very interesting from an athleticism perspective and somebody you could take a shot on later in the draft.
Sure. And interestingly, when you widen it to the top 100, a guy like Braden Swinson from LSU falls a little bit. He falls from one quadrant, the bottom right, we're safe, to the bottom left, which shows you how tenuous the line can be there.
For sure. And to me, that just, indicates that maybe he is worth taking later, right. Which he probably won't even be. He'll probably be taken in the top 100 picks. But I don't know if I was running the Eagles, which would be really cool, by the way, if I would make that selection.
We'll have to put you in touch with Alec Hallaby. You seem like you guys would speak the same way.
Absolutely would love that.
All right, so that's against the top 100. Anything else jump out at you? The Michael Williams guy seems to be a little bit all over when we look at these different quadrants and different comparisons.
Yeah, he is right on this top 100 line. People really like him.
Yeah.
I think personally, I don't know if I understand. I mean, I get where it's coming from, but I think based on this tool and just, watching his film, I think he's going to be a good player, but I don't think he's worth where they're projecting him.
Right.
And I think this tool supports that.
Okay. Good stuff. And that's the Georgia kid. Well, we have to talk about Georgia kids, because...
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about the Georgia kid, we could talk about Tyrion Ingram Dawkins. I mean, being crazy athletic freak.
Yeah, that is... Now, so this is interesting because he continuously, as we look at this, Ingram Dawkins sort of has the same kind of projection here as a Nolan Smith. He's constantly in that area. And as we bring up now versus the top 100 over the last 4 years, there it is again. Nolan Smith, who is consistently in that upper left quadrant of being highly athletic, not highly productive. And there's Tyrion Ingram, highly athletic, not highly productive. But that's also now thematic with this Georgia team, right, Sam, that we have to take this context in, is that they have so many guys, so many horses in their front 6 and 7. It doesn't seem like any one guy is overly productive because they all eat.
Absolutely. I mean, it's right in the name, right? They recruit the dogs. So
yeah.
I mean, just the fact that one picture with the Super Bowl where all three, down linemen were Georgia players, which is it's pretty crazy and pretty indicative of the recruiting culture. And honestly, maybe not the developmental culture, because I mean, they haven't been producing, but again, you can, attribute that somewhat to everybody's got to eat. And I think that's what you were saying. But they really have great athletes year in, year out.
Yeah. And sometimes that works out for you. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just get a guy who's a great athlete, but doesn't know how to rush the quarterback. Sometimes you do. You kind of wind up, or you get what you get in Jalix Hunt here, who's on this list again as someone who is highly athletic, but not as highly productive. But once you teach him a few things, you get Clint Hurt working on his toolbox, and then you give him a couple of weeks into a season, all of a sudden you start to see that the coaching combined with the athleticism starts to give you a semblance of a pretty good NFL player.
Absolutely. And that's what teams are hoping, right? Especially the Eagles, like in your example, is you take a shot on a guy with, extreme athleticism and you give him some time to develop and great coaching that he'll form into, a star NFL player.
Right. All right. Well, the crystal clear thing is no matter what you use as your tools for comparisons, Abdul Carter and Donovan Ezeraku are pretty much 1 and 2 there in all the important analytics departments as far as production versus athleticism. So be interesting. I would imagine that Ezeraku, as we move on, Sam, is someone who is high on the boards of certain teams that run a certain style of defense. Maybe not. I'm sure everybody probably has him in that top 35, 40 category, but I would think that some teams, you don't mind the undersized guys or the who don't pay as much attention to arm length or care about that as much, may have him as a top 15 to 20 guy.
Yeah, and I'm definitely in that latter category myself. I think that he's one of the best prospects in this year's draft.
Well, that is a pretty good thing if you're an Eagles fan and you want this guy to get him. Well, I don't know if that's a good thing because then he might be gone by 32.
Right, we got to keep it a little quiet until after the draft.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, nobody's ever heard of this guy. All right. Well, you put together some other pass rushing statistics for edges for this class, and you divided them into categories. Why don't you explain a little bit about the chart that we're looking at now?
Yeah. So these categories are just, a visual representation in a different way of the chart. So all the color categories are kind of the categorizations that we just talked about. Just from, instead of seeing it on a chart, it's a little bit more clean to look at. And so I just, I went and I got their PFF stats from the last 3 seasons for each of them respectively, just to compare, because it's kind of interesting to look at it, on that kind of basis. Right. So basically, Abdul Carter has the highest sacks per snap percentage. So again, we do it in 100, and the way you could think of it is out of 100 snaps, he gets a sack almost 5 of them. But that also interestingly serves as his sack rate, right? So he gets a sack 4.57% of the time. So you can look at it either one of those 2 ways, and it's a good way to understand the value that Abdul Carter would bring, or any prospect, under that parameter.
So that's pretty interesting because of what we said about his career. I mean, he wasn't really an edge rusher until the last year. He was stack linebacker 2 years ago, and this is the past 3 years of production. But in that defense that Manny Diaz was running, he did blitz Carter, I believe, from the stack position quite a bit. So I imagine he did have a bunch of pass rushing snaps, even when he wasn't an edge rusher.
For sure. But interestingly, he only had 547 snaps. And these snaps are exclusively pass rush snaps. I'd like to be very clear on that.
So that is why his are much fewer than everybody else's.
Correct.
Okay.
Him, and I believe there were a couple others that, moved around a little bit too. But if you look at it, a lot of these guys have like 700, 800, 900, some 1,000 pass rushing snaps over the past 3 seasons. So it does take into account that to some extent.
Right. On the left, where it says status, BC, HC, HCA, HF, HC 100. Can you explain that in good?
Yeah. So BC R1 is blue chip round 1. So that's just in the category of that top right. Used green, just, why not? Right. And then HC1 is high ceiling round 1 guys. So that's your guys that are in the top left quadrant for that green chart. And then high ceiling, high floor, purple is when we first started to have that purple chart. He falls into the blue chip, but I also don't feel like you can call him necessarily a blue chip because it's on the second chart. So that's why it's a different distinction. And then high ceiling 100 are those that fall in the top left quadrant, in the purple chart.
Yep.
And then good prospects are the ones that have high floors. I felt like calling them just high floors was not, a good enough indicator of their, status as players. Right. Dev is players that need development, but, have great potential. HF is those that have high floors, but in the red chart, the most the most inclusive chart, of all the players drafted, and then red is the avoid.
Gotcha.
And the ones that really jump out again is James Pierce, who has the highest pressure per snap rate at 21.24% or 21.24 snaps per 100.
Right. That's good. Good. If you're into that, playing at a high level and we're productive and you're not as concerned with fantastic athletic testing, not that he was that far, but amazing chart topping athletic testing, that's the type of guy for you.
Right. And I think there is going to be a team very early on that will take a chance.
And if you are the opposite, if you are like, give me the greatest athlete and I'll coach all of the pass rush into him, then and I don't care how unproductive he was, then Tyrion Ingram Dawkins from Georgia is certainly your guy because he's a red flag in all of these sack and pressure metrics.
Right. He had the lowest recorded of all of them. And he just didn't play a lot of snaps in the pass rush. He had 507. So, I mean, not a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of competitors, as we discussed previously, but extremely talented athlete and somebody with potentially very high upside.
Yeah. David Walker, interestingly, gets the green light in the total sacks at 37 and 151 total pressures from Central Arkansas.
Yeah. So it's so hard with the smaller schools because, your level of competition is significantly lower. So I would be significantly concerned if he wasn't the highest on here. He probably wouldn't even be discussed if he wasn't one of the highest or the highest.
Right.
And if you look, let's take a look at his.
Go back to his athletic testing. I was just thinking that.
He is an above average athlete in the purple chart, which means he would be also in the red chart as well.
Okay, so we'll take here, apologies for the wheeling and dealing here. All right, David Walker, and this is just a comparison of this year's edges. He's right along the line. His athleticism is decent at about 77, right?
Yeah.
And his production is just under the average at about 69. See, that's the red flag. You want a guy who plays at a lower level to just dominate so that's what NFL personnel people say. You want them to be highly, highly productive edge rusher if you're going to take them early in the draft. So, I mean, certainly, as we go and look at the ones with the Eagles in it, right? Jalen Hunt was not an extraordinarily productive player either, but he was a great athlete, and so they went and took him in the third round.
And I can already see people wondering if he has the highest sacks and the highest pressures, why his production score would be lower than average. And I think there are two possible and probable explanations for that. Number one is his rates per snap and per pressure. I'm sorry, sacks per snap and pressure per snap are lower relatively. And also it is very likely that there is some sort of discounting for talent in the algorithm used by NFL. But I think it's more likely that the actual rates are lower relatively.
Sure.
But
he's pretty consistently in that gems quadrant.
Yeah. And I very possible that he is one.
Yeah.
So
definitely a name to watch for. I like that. Definitely a name to look for. David Walker out of Central Arkansas. Isn't that where Scottie Pippen went? I think so.
I think so too.
A little on the young side for that, Sam.
Yeah, that's me trusting your word, honestly, at this point.
All right. Good stuff there. And that about wraps it up. I think we've gotten. Is there any other name you really wanted to get through or talk about on this edge that jumps out at you?
I just think maybe another mention of Elijah Roberts being another top 30 visit for the Eagles. That's another name. I know we mentioned him a little bit in passing, but just another guy that the Eagles have already shown interest in.
Right. And he, that's a pretty good rate right there. 16.81 pressures per snap. That would probably be on the higher end.
For sure.
Yeah. And he's out of SMU, as you mentioned, Elijah Roberts. All right. Developmental guy. Great stuff. That's going to do it for our look at edges from an analytics standpoint. And we'll do interior defensive lineman next when we have you back. Great job, Sam. Thanks. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Inside the Birds Analytics Style. And like I said, next one we'll do interior defensive line. For Sam Finkel, I'm Geoff Mosher. Thanks for watching.